Visual illusions, those fascinating memes and party tricks that seem so ripe for interpretation or misinterpretation, have an endless capacity to mesmerize, delight, and yes, divide us. Remember the dress that lit up the internet? Friendships tested, family dinners ruined, all over the question of whether this dress is blue and black or white and gold. Or this image that had everyone from Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling to the president of El Salvador weighing in on whether it's a horse or a seal, a fish or a donkey. Maybe these images fascinate us because most of the time the act of looking and seeing is something that seems so elemental, so effortless. Visual illusions force us to stop and consider how our sense of sight actually works and whether it is all that reliable. And for that reason, they are a valuable tool for researchers trying to understand the mysterious process of how we actually see the world. It's a question people have been asking and debating for millennia. Now, we've come a long way from ancient Greece, from Plato, who believed that light emanated from our eyes, provoking an interaction between the object and the soul. Aristotle then theorized that sight occurred when the air around an object and the liquid inside of our eyes formed a connection. 1,000 years later, in medieval Cairo, an Arab mathematician and physicist named Alhazen argued that vision starts when light bounces off of objects and enters the eye and travels to the back of the brain, which is the organ that is really giving us sight. And remarkably, Alhazen got it pretty much right. Today, vision scientists agree that we see not with our eyes, but with our brains. And it turns out that the brain is doing this with strikingly minimal information. Light enters the eye as a stream of tiny particles, photons. At the back of the eye, in the retina, microscopic photoreceptors, rods and cones as they are called, transform those bits of light into signals that travel along the optic nerve to the visual cortex, much as Alhazen postulated. Even more remarkable, only a small part of the retina, the center, called the fovea, sees in high resolution. So to see something clearly, our fovea has to be pointed directly at it. To get a sense of how small an area the fovea can take in at any given moment, you can draw a letter on each of your thumbnails and hold them at arm's length. If you do that, you'll notice that focusing on one of your thumbnails makes the letter on the other thumbnail appear blurry. For this reason, we all unconsciously move our eyes around constantly, scanning the world to gather up these tiny patches of high-resolution signal. And to put it all together, the brain must quickly fill gaps in the visual information it's receiving, creating a picture of the physical world that seems rich, coherent, and convincing, all in fractions of a second. Leading visual scientists to ask, how exactly do our brains accomplish all that? How much of what we see is objective reality, and how much of what we see is really the product of some fast and sometimes flawed interpretation? To examine those questions, each of our guests tonight uses the study of visual illusions to try to catch the mind in the act of seeing, asking in essence, how by fooling the eye, we can reveal the truth about our visual perceptions of the world. Susana Martinez-Conde joins us from New York City, where she directs the Laboratory of Integrative Neuroscience at SUNY Downstate Medical Center. She is one of the world's leading authorities on the neuroscience of magic. Welcome, Susana. Rodrigo Quiroga joins us from University of Leicester in the UK, where he is the director of the Center for Systems Neuroscience. He studies how memory impacts visual perception and is the discoverer of what has been called the Jennifer Aniston neuron, something that we're going to hear about later tonight. Welcome, Rodrigo. And finally, we have Emily Balcetis, who joins us from New York City, where she is an associate professor of psychology at New York University. She studies how our psychological states can change what we see and how our experience and motivations can influence how we see everything from visual illusions to police altercations to athletic challenges. Welcome, Emily, and welcome to you all. So I just want to begin to set the stage. Susana, why, and all of you can weigh in on this, why visual illusions? Why are they a good way in to that kind of investigation?
Well, the thing about illusions is that we often tend to think about them as the errors of perception, where the brain gets it wrong. But this is not correct. The fact is that illusions are not only inherent to all of our perception, they are not the exception, they are the rule, and in fact, they're necessary. We wouldn't be able to perceive if illusions did not exist the way they do.
Rodrigo, your take on that?
Yeah, I think you're tackling a very nice and philosophical issue, no? It goes back to, well, at least to Kant, I will say, because we don't see the reality as it is outside. We see our perception of reality, the way we interpreted it. And I think one of the take-home messages about how the brain works, one of the things I learned in all these years is that we don't see the things as they are outside. We just take very, very little information and we make a construction of the reality inside our heads. So actually we do see with the brain, the eye is just a sensory organ that brings this little information we capture, and then we create all this construction inside our heads. And visual illusions is when we try to fill in information that somehow lead us to see things that are striking.
Yeah. Emily, first thoughts?
In all honesty, I came to study visual illusions because they're just fun.
Yeah.
But more scientifically, the reason that I study them is that it gives us some insight into bigger social issues, like polarization in our society. Visual illusions are a very tight, experimental stimulus that we can present that can help us understand, why does somebody see it one way? Why does someone else see it an entirely different way? And from that basic understanding of the visual illusion, we can extrapolate to understand bigger social issues that might be related to political partisanship and other concerns within society that are leading us to have very different interpretations of what's happening in the world around us.
Jumping off from all those comments, what we're going to do here tonight is examine some very specific visual illusions to make this really concrete and visual, as the subject is. And just to give a sense of what it means to have the brain create things that do seem to be contrary to what we think is out there in the world, or examples where different people with different experience and different preconceptions will see different things in the very same image and so forth. And to that end, let's just jump in with the first example, a very simple illusion I think many people in our audience have seen. You look at this and, I think everybody sees a triangle in the middle, but then you ask yourself, is it really there? So, Rodrigo, take this first one away. What are we seeing here and what does it tell us?
Well, basically, we are inferring the form of a triangle just from the borders. And actually, you can make it more brutal. You can put the Pac-Mans a bit further away, but the moment you see the borders, that they coincide and that they form a line, we are feeling this information in our head, and we're actually perceiving these as lines that form a triangle. And it's very simple to break this illusion. You just rotate a tiny bit the Pac-Mans, and then you have the borders not coinciding with each other. Just a tiny misalignment will completely break the illusion. So it's a major principle, right? Is that we don't see all what is in front of us. We see very tiny bits of information, and we're constructing something in our head. In this case, from the borders, we're constructing the image of a triangle, and it's impossible not to see it.
Yeah, I found this one particularly interesting. The example that you talk about, rotating the Pac-Man, certainly takes the image away too. But I found it interesting if you mask it by just, say, putting a piece of paper over two of the three Pac-Men and then slowly move that piece of paper. Ask yourself, when does the triangle appear? Sort of, what's the minimal information necessary for this illusion to work? I presume it may be the same for everybody, but for me, I had to get past the second Pac-Man and just a little hint of the third. And that was enough for it to sort of just snap into focus. And as you say, you just can't unsee it at that point. So, Susana, you had a point that you wanted to make on this?
To me, what this illusion reveals is a couple of important concepts. First off, this famous classical Kanitsa triangle, it's constructed with very little information. So this is a filling-in illusion, but more generally, it reveals that with very scarce information, we can construct in our minds a pretty complex concept. So the brain doesn't need a whole lot to go on. But the other thing that I would address is that there is critical information. Having said this, there is critical information that these Pac-Man are provided, because this is not just an illusion about building a shape from a little bit of the edges. These are portions of the edges that are very specific, particularly the corners. And we have shown, for instance, in my laboratory, that even at the level of the retina, you're going to have stronger responses to corners than to straight edges. And in fact, if you open the Pac-Man and you had semicircles, for instance, and you push them against the sides of the triangle, so you had an equal portion of the triangle being revealed by the Pac-Man, but you wouldn't touch the corners, it would be much harder to make out the triangle from these illusory contours.
So let's go from there to another class of visual illusions. And this is sort of a very powerful example of contrast, that the eye and the brain is really focused upon relative differences as opposed to absolute. So tell us what we're seeing here.
I remember I was a postdoc at Caltech in California, and we have a lot of speakers coming to give seminars. And one of the speakers was a very good visual scientist from MIT called Ed Adelson. He showed exactly this illusion on the screen, and then he said, you know what? The squares, the checks of A and B are exactly the same color. And then we all look at the checkerboard and we say, no way. I mean, he means something else. And then he said, I will say it again. The check on square A and the check on square B are exactly the same color. And we all said, no, this cannot be. And they are. And you see that and you don't believe it. But for example, I mean, there are many ways to show that. You can occlude the rest of the image and just show the two checks without the checkerboard, and they are the same color. It's amazing. And then you see the whole image again, and they are not the same color. So physically, they are the same color. It is exactly the same tone of gray. But when the moment you see the whole image, your brain cannot avoid seeing them differently. And why is that? Well, because this is a checkerboard, and you know that some checks are whites and some others are black. So you cannot seeing one of the checks darker than the other because of the distribution on the checkerboard, because you know that one corresponds to a black check and the other one corresponds to a white check. And the illusion works because you are assuming they're white and you're assuming they're black, and you are not really processing every single pixel of color in this checkerboard. You're just having an inference based on your assumptions, and you just rely on that, and actually you cannot bypass them. The assumptions drive the perception. The assumption that a color is white, that one check is white and the other is black, is what drives your perception, not the physical stimulus in this case. So therefore, because of this information, because we know how a checkerboard looks like, we see it differently, although it's exactly the same color. And even if you know that it's the same, you cannot see it the same. And I found this really remarkable.
So if someone had never seen a checkerboard before, is the effect the same, or is it any different if they don't have that preconceived notion?
I would argue that it would nevertheless work, because what the visual system is doing here, besides having a prediction or an assumption about a checkerboard, is that we're making an assumption about lighting and shade. And so that green cylinder appears to be casting a shade. And so we are discounting the illuminant. That's basically, this is based on what we call lightness constancy or brightness constancy in the visual system. And what this basically means is that we see an object as having the same brightness or having the same color under very different illumination conditions. And this is why, for example, you take a newspaper and you look at it under artificial lighting, and then you go and you take it outside at noon on a sunny day, and you see in both instances black letters on a white background. However, the photons, if you were to measure with a photometer, the light energy reflected off of the black letters outside, these are higher luminance than the white background when you are inside under artificial light conditions. But your visual system is taking into account the illumination, the general lighting of the scene, and it's discounting the illuminant. And so that's what's happening here with these squares, that because they're not just plain squares, but we're interpreting them as falling in the shade or not, then you are discounting this information and applying it to make your best guesstimate, you being the visual system.
So I gather that what you're saying is one of the shortcuts that evolution has provided us in order that we can see continuity in the world, that we don't see an object in one lighting condition and a moment later see that same object in another lighting condition and think they're completely unrelated. In order to see the continuity of the physical world, we have this shortcut that subtracts out the differences in the environment in order that we can identify those objects that are consistent and continuous. So this is another one. I don't know if anyone can take us through what we're seeing here. The chess pieces certainly look different, but I gather in this illusion they're the same. Is that correct?
They are absolutely the same. Pixel by pixel, these chess pieces, they're exactly identical. They're not black and white. They're all something in between. Again, for the visual system, black and white are not absolute terms. Everything depends on contrast and context. And so we have these sort of like clouds enveloping these pieces, and we're taking this background, this context into account and deducing these pieces must be black when we see this sort of like a whitish clouds around them, and these pieces must be white when we see the dark clouds around the pieces. But they're, again, pixel by pixel, is exactly the same stimulus. Before we move on, I just wanted to mention that the wonderful chess piece illusion, this is by Bart Anderson and John Winower, and that it actually made the cover of Nature magazine some years back, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it's totally remarkable. I mean, I think I'm having the same reaction that Rodrigo had. Were you a graduate student? You were recounting that story of seeing the talk, because you look at this and you can't help but think that they are radically different. There's another example with colors. This is all shades of gray, black and white. I think we have a little famous visual demonstration of color. Can someone take us through, what we're seeing here?
In terms of this, the moving square illusion, it's basically the similar concept, now in motion, that makes it more striking. We have the same, I believe, gray square that is moving left and right, but we're going to interpret it not only as having different lightness, but having different colors depending on the background.
It's hard-pressed not to describe this as some kind of era. I know you cautioned us early on not to think of it in those terms, but is it wrong to think of this as a kind of limitation of our visual system to provide actual information about a physical object in the external world, but rather to always provide this comparative information of the object relative to its environment?
You have to weigh pros and cons. And so our visual system is not optimized, or it hasn't evolved to give us the most accurate picture possible. Is the good enough picture that will allow us to survive and to pass on the genes to the next generation and to be able to, frankly, recognize our children under different lighting environments inside and outside the cave so that we don't eat them.
Yes, that's a good thing. Everything that we've been talking about, for the most part, has been sort of a more or less a two-dimensional kind of visual illusion, but there are these really powerful, more three-dimensional visual illusions. I don't know how familiar you all are with this particular example where there's a real sense of waviness that's happening in the ground here. So what is it about the visual system that allows you to be fooled into thinking that there's this wavy structure, or at least cognitively, I'm pretty certain it's a flat ground? Do we understand this one well?
Well, I love this example, and that there are similar patterns that bring perceptual illusions and architecture together. There's another famous pattern similar to this in some ways in La Ramblas in Barcelona. But to me, what this really highlights is the fact that we are building a 3D concept where there is no, as you said, we have a flat floor, but we have this sort of like a waviness, a bit of a 3D concept, maybe some motion. But the reason why this may look 3D or it may look wavy, these are basically the same neural mechanisms that are being hacked into by the artists that produce this illusion that allow us to see motion and 3D in our daily lives. Because for one, 3D is always, our perception of 3D is a brain construct. Because even though we have 3D in the real world, objects have volume and so on, by the time the visual information arrives to our retinas are fundamentally flat surfaces. So whatever 3D existed in the world is lost in our eyes, and then it has to be rebuilt in the brain. So our experience of 3D is an illusion.
You know, another class of ambiguous scenes, of course, make use of the 3D environment, but in a way that our brains can sort of parse in two different ways, right? The simplest being just the Necker cube, the ordinary cube. You know, all of us, you look at that cube, you blink your eyes a few times, and it looks like you're looking either inside the cube or outside the cube. There's another wonderful, very famous one that we've all, of course, seen. I don't know if it's called the mother or the wife illusion. I don't know if that's PC to discuss it in that language any longer. But, you know, you look at this image, and if you stare at it long enough, it does bounce back and forth between two different interpretations. So, Emily, do you have thoughts on this? Is this, again, an experience informing a perception? Is it highlighting some shortcut in the visual system that is allowing the artist to manipulate us to see two different things depending on how we blink our eyes?
I mean, in some sense, it's an example of our intolerance for ambiguity. At first, it's just, you know, kind of an artistic effect, but our brain really wants to understand what we're looking at and impart meaning. And of course, there's meaning in all of these things, but it may not be readily available or something for us to be able to comment on and articulate right away. In these cases, the Necker cube and the two different women image, we're trying to decide, like, well, what's the foreground and what's the background? What's closer to us? What's actually further away? Even though we're seeing a two-dimensional image, we know that there is greater dimensionality actually there, and we're trying to make sense of that on the fly. And that's why we can flip between seeing the Necker cube as one that's going up or that we're looking down upon, or whether what's popping out to us is the older woman or the younger woman. And that's why we can also fluctuate, because both of those possibilities are correct.
Yeah, and you've done some work on, I guess, what's it called, the horse and seal illusion, which is kind of a variation on the same theme. So can you take us through what we're seeing here?
Sure. So if you haven't seen this before, and I give you a second or so, in that 1 second, you'll make sense of it. You're going to see something here. And about 80% of people see this as a horse. They see this as a horse's head. Now, for most people then, since that's the predominant response, if I were to say, but there's something else also that's also correct, there is a seal. the reaction I get often is like, what? Or no way, right? But for some people, those 20%, they do see that and they have a hard time accepting what 80% of the room says, which is that there is a horse there. So the seal is, it's the full body of a seal with his little face down in the bottom left corner and his tail protruding up, in case that was a challenge for some people to pull out. Now, where our eyes land first might be one of those factors that help us to make sense of one interpretation rather than another. The bottom left corner, again, is a particularly important spot on this image. And if that's where we look first and we try to piece those little bits together, that might be really important for us seeing the snout or the most protruding part of the horse there. But if our eyes first went to the upper right corner, maybe that's going to inform or make it easier for us to see the seal. So part of this interpretation is based on where do our eyes go first, and what input are we allowing our brain to try to make sense of and piece together and resolve the ambiguity of, which then informs our understanding of the rest of the image. But there's more to it than that. It's not just where our eyes go and how we piece together the local little edges and black and white features that are there, but there's psychological baggage that we bring to the table too. Our past experiences may be one. But in my lab, something that we looked at was motivation. What do we want to see? And if there's something that we want to see, is that also having an influence on what people come to interpret this image as first? So the way that we did this is we set this up as a game. We told people who came into our lab that we're going to do a taste testing experiment. We're going to have you sample some things in the lab. We would love to know, like a marketing test. What do you think about the quality of these? What should we market it for? How much should we price this at? What do you like it or do you not? But as scientists, we want to make sure that people are randomly assigned to experience some food or another food. And we're going to let the computer decide which of these two possibilities for your taste testing marketing experience you're going to get. In a sort of roulette or slot machine setup, the computer is just going to randomly present an image. If the image happens to be a farm animal, you'll get to taste jelly bellies, really wonderful jelly beans, exotic, wonderful, expensive jelly beans, and tell us about your experience there. But if it pulls up a sea animal, you're going to sample canned beans, gelatinous, partially liquefied canned beans. Far less interesting for most people than the Jelly Belly candies. So that's how we set up people's desires, their motivations, that what they want. They want, in this case, to see farm animals. They don't want to see the sea animals because they want to eat the Jelly Bellies. Then we show them this image for just 1 second. That's long enough for them to reach one interpretation, but not long enough for them to reach another interpretation. And when we do that, we find that more than 3/4 of people see this as a horse. But when we switch the motivations, when we switch that point structure and instead for other participants say, if it shows you a sea animal, then you'll eat the Jelly Bellies, and farm animals mean that you'll have the liquefied canned beans, then we see that ratio flip in dramatic ways. Now 3/4 of people, 2/3 of people can see the seal. When that's not the natural distribution, and that's not what people in another rewarding condition had experienced. So when we induce that want or that desire, we have an additional impact on how people resolve the ambiguity of this figure.
Wow, that's really remarkable. Another really powerful example, at least to me, of ambiguity and how our brain tries to resolve it. I'd never seen this video before, but can we do this little experiment here? I'm sure all of you are familiar with it, but if you look right in the center at the cross, and then allow these images of famous celebrities to flash by, if you're like anybody else, I guess, as the images flash by, it's really freaky what you see, right? I mean, distortions all over the place of these famous faces. So Susana, do we understand what's happening here inside of our brains?
It's mainly a matter of contrast. So again, this time in the face recognition domain, this highlights that for the brain there are no absolute terms. And so the way the solution works is that you have all of these faces of these generally beautiful people, A-list actors, and that individually are going to be looking just fine. better than fine. But because of the way that they are lined up, our brains are forced to make this online comparison. And they're very specifically selected so that you will have somebody, say, with a normal, average-sized nose right after somebody who has a small nose, and our brain is going to be exaggerating the size of the average nose in comparison, and so on and so forth. So the features of each of these individual people, because the brain is constantly comparing with what came before, they become caricatures of themselves.
Yeah, I mean, do you find this as mind-blowing as I do, or maybe is this like a hackneyed video in the field, and you're like, oh, not that, not the famous face video again, or does this?
No, this is a wonderful illusion. It's very powerful.
So let's look at another visual illusion. So, Emily, maybe you can take us through what we're seeing here. You know, it starts as a bunch of splotches and then resolves into something more familiar. So, what happens as we look at this image?
Well, sure. If this is the first time that you're seeing this snowstorm, you might be wondering, like, well, what is this? And your brain might be quickly trying to couple some of the black bits together, or you might be trying to effortfully recombine them because you just don't even know what this is. If you have seen it before, you know exactly what it is that you're looking at. For me, I have read through all of the textbooks that showcase this, so I cannot unsee what's in here, which is a dog. It's an image of a dog, of a Dalmatian, in fact. Now, I wonder if, having said that, if people who hadn't seen it before can now pick out the dog that's in there. And once you have, it's so hard to just see this as a random collection of dots, as the snowstorm that we first opened this up as. Again, because we have that past experience that resolved the configuration of dots in a particular way, perhaps sort of imbued some connections between these dots that aren't actually there, but is essential for us to put together the visual experience of where the dog's face is, where the body is, where the legs are.
So, Rodrigo, do we have a sense of what's happening at a neurological level when the brain is able to find coherence and see the Dalmatian in this image versus the state that it started in, where it's just a bunch of splotches on the page?
Well, I mean, you clearly, at some point, you recognize that there's a Dalmatian. I mean, when I see this image, I know this image, I immediately see a dog. I mean, I don't see the snow anymore. I just see a Dalmatian straight. But it's because I have seen it before. So I think the moment we see that and we recognize that, we are creating a representation that is slightly different to the first initial representation. So we add more information to that, and we somehow encode in our brain this information that, I mean, here is not just a random set of snowflakes and so on. It is the image of a dog. And we cannot undo it. I mean, it's impossible for me not to see a dog anymore.
You know what's interesting, though, and again, I don't know if this is peculiar to me or whether it's maybe intrinsic to these kinds of images. I had never seen this image before until quite recently. And at first, I went through exactly the process that Emily and Rodrigo are describing. I didn't see anything at all. And then all of a sudden, the Dalmatian popped out at me, and then I couldn't unsee it, as you're saying, except when I changed the scale of the image. I can't help but fiddle. I'm a fiddler. So I made the image much different size than when I initially encountered it. I made it much smaller. And then I lost the Dalmatian for about 10 or 15 seconds. I stared, and then the Dalmatian came back. So is there an element of recapitulating the process that you first saw the image? And if you radically change the scale or maybe the lighting or things of that sort, you can unsee the thing that and otherwise would be something that you couldn't erase that image?
I think what you're doing is when you see the image, I see some features. It's not that I see a dog straight. I see some features of the dog that gives me the image of the dog. So I see the face. I know more or less what the face is because I have seen this image before. And then I can recognize immediately the posture of the dog and I can get through the whole body. Now, if you start feeling with the image, as you said, and you lost the scale and you lost where the head must be and so on, then I can understand that it will take you some time to figure out, okay, what is the exact position of the dog now? But once you recognize this feature, I mean, it's kind of like the whole thing appears again.
So, Susana, is this a nature or nurture in your opinion, this particular illusion?
Well, it's both. Nature and nurture come together in this particular image. Is that our brain is always trying to solve ambiguity, something that we don't realize because we have been used to seeing our whole lives. Those of us who are sighted, that is that. The visual input is just very ambiguous. Even at the level of our retinas, we have a constant confound between the size of an object and the distance of that object from us. And we are not used to recognize that. But the fact is that it's very uncomfortable. And so our brains are not settled in a way until we're able to manage the ambiguity. And so I think in this particular image with the dog, once that our brain realizes, oh, it's a dog, now we don't need to keep going with the snowstorm and analyzing it and trying to figure out what's there. We have a dog, and that's our shortcut to this image. So that's a very useful skill to be able to develop and to apply in the future. If I'm ever faced with this image, with this situation again, which here is a Dalmatian dog, but it could be a real life predator, I'll be able to recognize it and I'll have my shortcut and I can act quickly without spending a lot of resources that may be very costly.
And then presumably you're able to cede that capacity to subsequent generations because you were able to escape that predator because of that shortcut that your brain used to recognize this danger in the environment. So Rodrigo, that speaks to both the evolutionary utility of the computational shortcuts that the brain takes to gain some story about what's happening in the objective reality, but also speaks to memory as a vital part of what shapes how we see the external world. And I know that's an area that you have spent a lot of time researching. So maybe just first as an overview, what is the role of memory in everything that we're talking about here tonight?
Well, I mean, memory and perception, they are quite interlinked, no? Because memory impacts perception, and perception, of course, impacts memory. So there are two different functions of the brain, but they are interacting with each other. What I really like to see is there's a general principle that I think applies both to perception and to memory. And you're talking about evolutionary advantages and so on. Let me give you a very simple example. And the example is when we learn how to read. And when you get a child that starts reading, I mean, they will go letter by letter. And then at some point, I mean, they will construct the words or the syllables. And at some point, they will go syllable by syllable and then word by word. And when we read a book, we don't even go word by word. We just jump. I mean, we just jump. I mean, we leave all the articles aside. We just jump from words to words. I mean, and we go much faster because we don't want to spend the time in reading all the things that we can fill in. We know what the article it is because we know we have read many books. We don't need to process this information. It's a waste of time, right? And I think that's more or less how it works with vision and how it works with memory. So the way our memory works is basically you don't want to remember everything that happens to us because otherwise it will be too much information. And what you want to do is you want to extract a meaning from what is happening, remember a few events, salient events, and then you construct a story in your head. You give an interpretation. Let me give you another example. If you watch a movie, you will not be able to recapitulate the whole movie from beginning to end. But you don't want to do that. You want to remember the argument of the movie. And maybe telling the argument of a movie is just a couple of minutes. But you don't want to remember 1.5 hours. You want to understand the movie. And understanding the movie is exactly this process of getting very little pieces of information and then trying to construct a story about it.
Yeah, no, there's a powerful short story I read some time ago about an individual who cannot forget anything. And the trauma that creates in a life if you had 100% accurate memory of everything that you ever encountered.
That's a story from a writer called Jorge Luis Borges, an Argentinian writer. He told a story called Funes de Memorios, and it's actually about a guy that cannot forget. And first you think, well, that's great because, I mean, I will do great at university, at school. I mean, if I can remember everything, my exam, I will get top marks and so on. But then Borges realizes, well, actually, if you don't forget anything, then you start to struggle because you cannot really think properly.
Yeah, I can imagine. You can't see the forest for the trees. I mean, it's like you're just overwhelmed by the detail. So Rodrigo, I want to drill down on one particular relevant discovery of yours to the conversation that we're having right here. I don't know if you like the name or don't, but it's usually called the Jennifer Aniston neuron, where you had this amazing discovery of neurons responding to very specific stimuli in the external world. Can you just take us through that episode a little bit and give us some sense of what you extracted from it?
The experiments it's a very simple story. There are some patients that they're epileptic patients, and for clinical reasons, they get implanted electrodes inside the head. And the reason for doing that is to try to cure them from epilepsy, because then the doctor will try to localize where the epileptic seizures come from and then evaluate the potential surgical intervention that may cure the patient and so on. Now, there are many technical details that I will skip, but the idea is that these patients, they stay in the hospital for about 1 week or so, and then they have the electrodes inside the head, the electrodes implanted. And this gives us the amazing opportunity to try to understand what the neurons were recording from, what are they doing. And then when I started to get involved in these experiments, at the time I was at UCLA in California, I started showing pictures. So I would put the laptop in front of the patient, and I will show different pictures, and I will see what the neurons I'm recording from are doing. And the Jennifer Aniston neuron is nothing more, nothing less than finding a neuron that will respond to Jennifer Aniston, but not just to one picture of Jennifer Aniston, to any picture of Jennifer Aniston. And I did a search in Google Images very quickly. I tried to get pictures as different as possible because I thought, well, is it really this picture that is triggering the firing of the neuron, or is it her? And then I just came up with 7 completely different pictures of her, different poses, different profile, different haircuts, and so on. And the neuron responded to all of them and to nothing else, to nothing of all the other pictures I showed. So this was telling me, okay, the neuron is firing to her, it's firing to a concept, in this case, the concept of Jennifer Aniston. So that was the first, and that was the main discovery. But then as I found the Jennifer Aniston neuron, there were many others. In another patient, I found one firing to any picture of Halle Berry. And also if I wrote the name, whenever I wrote the name Halle Berry, the neuron fired, and not if I wrote other names. So the interesting point is that these neurons are in an area that is known to be critical for memory. It's called the hippocampus. And it makes sense that we have neurons firing to concepts, to abstractions in this area that is a memory area, because that's the way we remember. We tend to forget details, and we tend to remember more concepts and associations between concepts. Or that's the primary way of remembering. That's the skeleton of our memories, I will argue.
And so most of us who are not neuroscientists but sort of think about these ideas, I've always assumed that a complex concept like Jennifer Aniston, right? That's a complex, high-level concept would require all sorts of neurons to be interacting in some complex network that would be required to bring up that higher level notion of a human being of a particular sort, living in this particular time period and so forth. But you're saying that somehow a single neuron can capture that concept. Is that the main import?
If it is a single neuron, I should be playing roulette in Las Vegas because I will be the luckiest scientist in history. If there's only one neuron firing to Jennifer Aniston,
that's true.
I should be very, very lucky. So a very simple argument shows you that, well, if I found one neuron, there have to be more.
Yeah.
I just found one out of, I don't know how many, maybe thousands in this area and so on. But then the second point is that these neurons are not alone in the brain. So the hippocampus, the area where we found these neurons, is very high up in the level of processing visual information. So if you imagine that you start from the eye, the retina, you go to the lateral genicular nucleus, then you go to B1 in the back of your head. If you start drawing all the areas that are involved in the processing of visual information, there are a huge number of steps, and at the very top, you end up at the hippocampus. So why do we have neurons in the hippocampus firing in this remarkable way, in such a complex way? Well, it's because this is relying on many areas before that has been processing the information. So I will say the Jennifer Aniston neuron is not there on its own. It's actually getting the information from previous areas that process different aspects of the picture or of Jennifer Aniston herself.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah, please.
So I think for me, I had this experience of learning how do we make sense of other people's faces that resonated with a very basic principle, which is when we are looking at other human beings, we're not looking at their nose and their mouth and their eyes and the and the specific hair, looking at those local features, we look at the gestalt. So there is a nose shape, that's Jennifer Aniston's nose. There's a haircut, that's her iconic style. But when we're looking at Jennifer Aniston, we look at the whole picture and not the basic features that make her up. And that's true for all people that we have a lot of experience seeing. A good friend of mine once had played a game with me. She asked my husband, who was not my husband at the time, to take pictures of his hands, of his nose, of his foot, of a part of his hair. And she asked a bunch of our friends to do that. And then she put an array on the screen and said, which one is your future husband's nose? Which one is your future husband's hair? Which one is your future husband's foot? And I failed. Even though I was about to marry this man and I had seen his face and all of him for years and years and years, I couldn't pick out the local features because that's not how we see people, especially people that we have a lot of experience looking at. We look at the gestalt. We see the gestalt, not their nose separated from their eyes, separated from their hair. Again, it goes back to the idea that our past experience really informs our how we perceive. And when it comes to seeing faces, we don't see the local features. We see them all together in configuration.
And was your husband convinced by your gestalt explanation, or did he?
Well, he married me nonetheless,
Good,
so I guess
good.
it worked.
Great. So it's a wonderful interplay between the physical stimulus and all the other architecture from memories and experience that we hold inside of our heads. And it's out of the collision, if you will, between the higher level memories and experiences and the lower level data that the eye takes in, that this ultimate image of the world is built inside of our heads. Now, there's a powerful example of this, Emily, that I think everyone in the world is familiar with. It was this example of the blue dress, the white dress that just sort of took over the internet some years ago. Can you just tell what happened with this? Why do you think people got so worked up about this particular example?
I mean, this is another example just of how we are so convinced that what we are seeing is the right way to see it. We have a sort of naive realism that what is coming through our eyes and the experiences that we have are true and accurate. That's why visual illusions are so fun because they defy what we believe to be true. So we naively believe that what we are seeing is accurate. It's the way that things really are. So when I see this as a white and gold dress, I cannot understand how someone could see it as blue and black or whatever it is that they experience. And because we are so convinced that what we see is right, and because this is such a powerful illusion, it's actually one of the illusions that was most polarizing in society. That, it was, so the story goes, ripping families apart. They would have these tremendous fights at the dinner table because, they're like, you either must be lying or you're stupid that you are seeing this as blue and black because it is white and gold. The illusion is just that powerful, that that it's one of these that has sort of taken on a legendary status in the world.
And so, is this an example of something that is a powerful party trick, or is there real science that follows along the lines of what we've been discussing? I mean, Susana, what's your take on this example?
This illusion has been so important for visual science, and it was a whole new category of illusion. And we're talking about 2015, and people are freaking out on social media, and vision scientists are freaking out at in our correspondence and at academic conferences because nobody knows what's going on. And what this highlights is that there is this range of individual differences that we didn't know about. So let me explain. So this is a color illusion. So we know about color illusions. We know how something can look one color versus another, depending on contrast, context, etc., as we have been discussing. But mostly everybody saw the same thing in the same wrong way for the same exact image. But here we have an image in which half of humanity is seeing it one way and half of humanity is seeing it the opposite way. And now we have more of these examples, but back then, this was something completely revolutionary about what it revealed, how important individual differences can be in perception.
And so what are the individual differences? Like, what have we learned? Like, why is it that half of us see it one way, half the other?
Well, it's still sort of like a work under progress. But what the consensus seems to be more or less right now is that if we talk about the original dress image, this was photographed under the perfect storm of ambiguous illumination conditions. The picture of the original dress, the lighting is a mixture of yellow and blue light. And so when you discount the illuminant, when your visual system is trying to discount the illumination conditions to arrive at the true color of the image, different people are going to be discounting either the bluish part of the lighting versus the golden parts of the lighting. There may be an evolutionary aspect as well here, because as it happens, blue and yellow have been the lighting conditions under which our visual system has evolved. The blue of the sky and the golden light from the sun. So it appears to be, and this is still under investigation, and that there are some scientists, for instance, Pascal Wallace here in New York City has done really good work in this type of illusion. But it seems that those people who see the dress as black and blue, they are interpreting the dress as if it's under direct sunlight, whereas the people that see the dress as white and gold, they're interpreting, this is mostly unconscious, of course, but they're interpreting the dress to be in the shade. And why is it then that some people interpret the dress as being in the shade versus being under direct sunlight? The best answer that we have right now, that this is probably about our priors, perhaps our previous life experience with these type of lighting conditions. But again, this is research that is being actively done right now.
So the question that brings to mind for me is, can you disambiguate how we see the dress by giving us just a little bit more in the image that will make it clear whether it's direct sunlight or perhaps, later in the day, blue sky? Will then we all agree on the color of the dress?
Yes, it has been done. And in fact, well, the actual dress, and for a while it was vision scientists, they purchased the dress and they would wear it at vision conferences. But the actual dress, if you see it under white light, everybody would agree that is black and blue. So it's really an issue of what the illumination conditions are. And there have been demonstrations at vision conferences in which scientists have brought the actual dress and varied the lighting and have it look one way versus another.
Rodrigo, are you convinced by that explanation? Is that what the cause of all the uproar was about?
For me, it's white and gold no matter what. I cannot see how people can see this in blue.
So I just want to do one final topic before we wrap up here. And Emily, it has to do with work that you've done, which has kind of like a real world impact of, expectation and bias when it comes to interpreting things in the external world. And you studied, I gather, body cam footage and had some striking insights into the way that various distinct people will interpret the same footage. Can you just take us through that a little bit?
Sure. I mean, the idea here is that video footage is making its way into the courts at an exponential rate. But not only the legal courts, but the court of public opinion, as videos documenting altercations between police and civilians or members of two different social groups, maybe a black man and a white man, are surfacing and then going viral, and we are all acting as jurors, whether actually sitting in the courtroom doing it or sitting at home and talking with friends and family about what's happening in the world around us. An example that we found, was an altercation between a police officer and a civilian. It was a fairly routine pullover, and there's some conversation that happens first, and the civilian is resisting the requests of the police officer. The police officer goes to restrain the civilian on the hood of the police officer's cruiser. We're seeing the perspective through the dashboard camera, actually, so we can see both parties, which is important here. And even if you're watching it with audio, it helps to understand what's going on. But without the audio, it's our visual system that's left to interpret what it is that we're seeing. There's one key moment that's depicted in a still shot that we can share, which is that the police officer now sort of has the civilian in a chokehold, and the hands of the civilian are down here by the police officer's hands, and you see this dramatic arm movement. And it's a powerful moment, because it's the moment, what we're seeing is right before the police officer then strikes the civilian on the back of his head with a closed fist. It looks like a punch. It looks like a very strong strike to the backside of the civilian. And because of this big movement, this big arm movement that takes up a lot of visual space within the video footage, that's where our eyes are drawn. Our eyes go up to where that movement has happened. What that means is that we miss what's happening down here, where the hands are, where the police officer's hands are, where the civilian's hands are. And generally, when you ask people, has the police officer engaged in use of force? A lot of people will say, yeah, why is he punching the civilian in the back of the head? Right? That's extreme. He has him restrained. He's on the hood of the car. He's not flailing around. And so this punch, this strike is unwarranted. And that is because that's what our eyes have seen. That's where our attention is drawn. And as a result, we miss what's happening. What we're missing is that the civilian has drugs in his hand that he's trying to pass from one hand to the other, that then he puts into his mouth to swallow, and he's biting the police officer. And we miss that. We miss that entirely, because we are attending to this area of the video footage, so we're missing what's happening down here. So we have this very rich, visual input, but it's actually really complicated. Even if an altercation lasts, a minute or 30 seconds, and that's a critical moment, there's so much that happens within videos. As two people move within space, within time, it is actually overwhelming for our visual system to take in all of it with precision and accuracy, and to understand exactly what it is that we're looking at. And then when we extrapolate from that, if the understanding is like, I may not have seen everything that's actually there, and in fact, I can't, nobody can, and know that that's the basis for consequential decisions like, should this person be put in jail? Should this person be fined? Should they be relieved of their position? Then we can understand how you and I might have very different decisions, come to very different decisions about that, about who's the bad guy in this video, despite the fact that we all saw the very same thing.
Susana, what's your take on this example?
So this video reminded me of a magician principle, which is magicians, they have these sayings, and one of them is that a big motion covers a small motion. And so this often happens in magic tricks. The magician may be doing a very wide motion of the arm that captures attention, and the fingers may be doing something that is imperceptible to the audience, even in plain view. So I just thought of that, and I think it's also interesting that how we have this dual limitation in our perception. We have talked about how the fovea is the highest resolution part of our retina, only equivalent to the width of our thumbnail at arm's length, and everything else is low resolution. But to that, we have to add our attentional spotlight, which, interestingly, attentional spotlight is a metaphor that both neuroscientists and magicians use. But what that means is that everything that we're not actively paying attention to, we're actively suppressing. Our brain is the magician's confederate, so to speak. And so we're constantly suppressing whatever we're not focusing on. And this can mislead us on occasion, as in magic tricks and perhaps with some of these confrontations footage, but it can also be positive because it gives us focus. And oftentimes people ask me, well, what can I do to overcome this inability to multitask? I would like to be able to multitask, to do things at once. We can't. We're not wired for that. What we're wired for is focus, and that's really our superpower. But basically, in every realm of human activity, without this ability to single-mindedly focus and suppress everything else that is not relevant, we wouldn't have art, we wouldn't have sports, we wouldn't have science. So it really is an advantage.
And so you, as a scientific research study, Susana, you've actually studied magicians and how they execute their craft. Do you find that magicians have some kind of intuitive understanding of the kind of things that we've been speaking about here tonight so they can leverage the shortcuts of the human visual system toward the end that they seek?
They often do. There are different kinds of magicians, though, and the magicians that we have tended to collaborate with, they're not just performers, they're magic theorists. And so magic theory is this field of magic where magicians really wonder about what makes magic work in the mind of the spectator. And some of these magicians, they will read some of the neuroscience literature and are well acquainted with the general principles, and others may not, but they still have hypotheses, and there are treatises about magic that have, for many decades, magicians have hypothesized as magic theorists why magic works. And so we have had the opportunity actually to do a couple of experiments with magicians in which we tested their hypothesis in the lab about why magic might work. And in some cases, the magicians were correct. In other cases, they were not. And so this was interesting because up until that point, we felt that we had benefited from magic methods and misdirection techniques to use in the laboratory to further our research and to learn more about the mind and the brain. But we then realized that we can also help magicians by applying the scientific method and help them test various magic theories.
And I think we have one particular magic demonstration. Perhaps we can use that as a small case study. So maybe we can pause to roll in the video.
Hi, my name is Patrick Terry, and I am thrilled to be here at the World Science Festival. My background is in magic, specifically the theory and practice of sleight of hand, and I'd like to demonstrate one of my favorite pieces. It involves the 4 famous aces that you'll see here, and 12 other cards, which I will display in small columns. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, we can move them how we like. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. 16 cards will start, and we'll also end with 16. Now, I'd like to put your attention on the ace of hearts. We're going to start with this column first. Again, you'll notice we have 1, 2, 3 cards and the ace of hearts. 4 cards, 1 ace. Don't blink. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you'll notice that the ace completely disappears. Again, the front and backs of each card. So you can see now what's going to happen. Going to attempt to vanish all the aces. Now it's a little trickier because you know what to look for. Ace of clubs is next. This one will be very quick. That's 1, 2, 3 cards and the ace of clubs. Once again, don't blink. Ace of clubs on the table. That's 1, 2, 3, and 4. And once again, the ace completely disappears. 2 down, 2 to go. Now, ace of diamonds is next in our pattern. And just again, you can see our 3 in different cards. In this case, I'll give you a more genuine advantage. I'll keep these facing down so you only have to watch the 1 ace of diamonds. I'll count very slowly. That's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Don't blink. 1, 2, 3, 4. And the ace completely disappears. But the thing I like about this trick is they aren't simply vanishes. The aces actually transport. So now you'll notice that we have 1, 2, 3, and 4 aces right here before your very eyes, as though by magic.
All right. So, wonderful trick, wonderful trick. What insight can any of you provide to what we just saw? Susana, I think I actually work with that magician. Is that correct? Is that one of, yeah.
Yes. It's Patrick Terry. He's wonderful. One important principle, I think, in magic. I often think of it as working as an onion. You have all of these layers upon layers of misdirection. And so one particular point that there are several points, but let me start with multitasking. This is a trick that by its very configuration is forcing us to multitask, because we have all of these different locations where the 4 aces are going to disappear and eventually reappear. We have 4 possible locations on the table, and so we're trying to keep track of various things going on at once. Visually, not only that, but Patrick is using this, what magicians call patter. He's storytelling. He's capturing not only our auditory sense, but also is creating this internal dialogue. So we have all of this, the visual part, the auditory part, our cognitive speculations about the trick as it develops. They're conflicting for our attention. It is really a divide and conquer approach.
And so is it the case, for instance, that, were I or somebody in the audience, if they were hearing impaired or couldn't be distracted by the auditory patter, would the trick not work as well if without that distraction?
It would still work because, like I said, these are many layers. No magician is going to rely on this one little thing. So they have a lot of bulletproofing. So if something fails, you still have something else going on. And so I really shouldn't be exposing any magic secrets that we don't have to. But for instance, part of what's going on here as well is that there's an expectation of a pattern. So Patrick makes the first 3 aces disappear. By the time that you get to ace number 4, you think that the same thing is going to happen. Your brain is applying this shortcut based on prior experience. You have this expectation, and that works against you. Also, we have spoken about perspective and vantage points. Again, not to disclose too much, but this trick would look very different if you were standing from behind Patrick as opposed to in front of him.
Got it. Emily, any thoughts on the relationship of the technique of the magician to manipulate our gaze and the work that you've done on seeing where the gaze of the audience looks, for instance, in video footage and eyewitness testimony?
The idea is that we set up an expectation that we come in thinking this is the way that the world works. Or in the case of just watching that magic trick now, especially he does it once and then he does it twice and he does it 3 times, we form a hypothesis about what's happening. What's he really doing? When we watch him do that trick the second time, we watch him do it the third time, we're not watching to take in everything that he's up to. We're watching to test our hypothesis. And we're looking to confirm that our hypothesis is true. Everybody's brain goes about testing their hypotheses in a biased way, that we are more receptive and we look for information that confirms what we think should be true, and we are less open to information that tells us that we're wrong. That's just the way that the human brain works. We don't give both sets of information equal weight, which is why some of these magicians are able to pull off the sleight of hand tricks that they do, because they've set up the expectations that we then, in a biased way, go out testing. When we've looked at this within our lab, we've seen a similar pattern, not just with what do people think about, what information do they accept to confirm a hypothesis, but what are their eyes doing? And we, along with other researchers, have called this visual confirmation bias, that when we're looking at a scene, we're not looking to take in everything, especially if we have an idea about what it is that we should be seeing. So we go about looking at the world in a biased way, and it's in a way that allows us to maintain that belief that what we first thought was true is in fact true.
You've also found that one's frame of mind, one's expectations, one's motivation can change our interpretation of a task or the environment in a way that may allow us to do better than we otherwise would, for instance, in sporting events and so forth. Can you just give us a sense of those results?
Sure. So if we take the idea here that we have limitations on what we can focus on, what our foveal view can process at any one point in time, it can lead to these unfortunate, or it can serve as an explanation for this polarization in society about how we interpret video evidence. But we can also use that same principle of visual experience, that narrowed focus of attention, like what we can focus on is relatively limited, and use it to our advantage. We've spent 15 years studying how can we take advantage of that limitation of our visual experience and help people exercise more effectively. So this investigation really started when I had the opportunity to interview some of the world's fastest runners, some gold medal Olympic athletes, sprinters, long distance runners, and ask them, what are you looking at as you're racing to the finish line and trouncing the competition? I am nowhere near that level. In fact, some days I can hardly run at all. So it's not surprising that what I thought they were looking at is exactly wrong. I thought that they had some remarkable powers of sight, that somehow they could take in their peripheral vision. They know where they are relative to the competition at any point in time and focus and being focused on the finish line. But that's not what they do. They say, whether they are a long distance or a short distance runner, that they've chosen a target, they focus on the finish line, on the next bend in the curve, somebody up ahead who's wearing bright pink shorts. They almost put on blinders in a sense, and they tune out what's in the periphery. It's like a spotlight shining on a target that they've decided to focus their attention on. That's a trick that they've used or that they think contributes to their success. When we teach normal people like myself, like my sister, like my friends to do that same thing that the Olympic runners do, first of all, they can. Those are easy instructions to follow. Choose a target, focus on it, and don't pay much attention to what's on the periphery. What we found is that induces an illusion of proximity. That finish line or that target now appears 20 to 30% closer than it does if we look around in a more natural manner, paying attention to what's on the left and the right and in front of us. That illusion of proximity is really important. That visual illusion that finish line is actually closer than we would otherwise see it, has this whole cascading effect on our psychology. Now, it seems a little bit easier to cross the finish line faster, because it seems like it's closer than it would otherwise appear to us. We believe in ourselves more. We have a self-efficacy that we otherwise would lack. And that translates into improved performance. So again, when we taught people to use that narrowed focus of attention that the Olympic athletes use, not only does that finish line look closer, but people actually move faster. They move 23% faster to the finish line when they engage in the exercise, and we're standing there with our stopwatches timing them. When we asked them how did it feel, they said it felt 17% easier. The task is the same. The finish line is the same distance for everybody. It's just that visual illusion of proximity changes their psychology, their expectations for themselves, and that translates into improved performance in that moment in our lab. When we teach them that strategy and then say, why don't you try it for the next week? Use a fitness app to track how you're moving, where you're walking, what you're doing, how you're exercising. And do you mind if we take a peek at that app at the end of the week? What we see is that they go out for more walks in the week. They take 85% more steps on those walks, and they travel about 3/4 of a mile further during each walk. And again, it's not magic. It's that change in the visual experience of what we're directing our attention to changes our psychology, which leads us to feel like this is easier than I thought it would be, and then I'll try it again and have this impact that it wouldn't otherwise.
So I think we all agree that the shortcuts that the human brain takes evolved through our own evolution as a species because of the particularities in our historical past that may have favored one particular brain approach over another and allowed that to seed future generations. Can you imagine that one day we encounter, say, extraterrestrial intelligence, life, and we're able to communicate with them? We find a way of communicating with them, but their view of what the external objective world is radically different from ours because of the way that the evolutionary history on their planet has biased and created certain shortcuts in their alien brains. Can you imagine that disjuncture between two intelligent life forms that can communicate about a supposedly objective world?
Imagine the following. Imagine that I tell you, okay, I follow your argument, and I say, well, there's an alien species that they don't actually have eyes. They just sense magnetic field or electric field. And they just emit electric field around it, and then they just sense this perturbation of electric field, and the whole perception of the world, the whole reality is given by how they resense the electric field they just emit. Actually, this exists. I mean, these are fishes in the Amazonas. I mean, the world is just that. It's the electric fish that you can catch in Brazil. So that's why sometimes it's interesting to study other species. You don't need to think about aliens. You need to think about different species, that they were more on olfaction, I mean, or they were more on auditory, or they were more, in this case, on sensing electric field. And it gives you a completely different view. Well, I don't know, I cannot feel like an electric fish, but if you start imagining how it may work, I mean, how the representation of the reality is for these different species, I mean, then you have your aliens, and then you have a different type of thoughts and way of coping with things.
Yeah, so as soon as the fish begin to speak, we can begin to compare different ways of talking about the world. So Susana, final word on that?
Yeah, to build on that, what Rodrigo has expressed, we have, a multitude of aliens here in our own planet. Earlier, when we were discussing color, I meant to say that when we were talking about how the color that we see may be wrong or it may not match reality, well, color does not exist in reality. We have wavelengths, but color exists in the brain. Color is itself an illusion or a brain construct, if you can think of it, because our experience of color, our visible spectrum for a human being is going to be very different to what an insect can see, for instance, and that we don't know what it is to see in the infrared or in the ultraviolet end of the spectrum. So yes, we don't need to rely on sci-fi to start asking these questions.
Absolutely. Well, Emily, any final thoughts on that question?
Oh, I resonate with what everybody has said, and just say, like, there are aliens among us already. The sharks that read electric fields, electromagnetic fields, and any animals that we get to experience maybe on a more everyday basis that have eyes on the sides of their heads rather than on the front of their heads. And once we start realizing or thinking outside of our own physical construction, we can realize that there's a lot more diversity out there that can give us insight into what the aliens we may eventually encounter, how they experience the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you all. It's been a fascinating conversation on visual illusions and the brain and the nature of reality and how we interface with it. And thank you so much for sharing your insights on this topic with us today.